So welcome to the first program in a new series sponsored by the International Cultic Studies Association called ICSA Conversations. Tonight, a renowned and widely published expert in the field of cultic studies, Dr. Benjamin Zablocki, speaks on a term that has been used and Dr. Zablocki suggests misused for decades, brainwashing. Is it a scientific concept or merely a label? Dr. Zablocki, former chair of the Department of Sociology at Rutgers University, has been studying cults, communes, and charisma for more than 50 years. He's the author of The Joyful Community and also Alienation and Charisma, and co-editor with Thomas Robbins of Misunderstanding Cults, Searching for Objectivity in a Controversial Field. He's currently writing a book developing a biopsychosocial theory of charismatic resocialization, sometimes called thought reform or brainwashing. He says about the book, this is a quote, "My goal is to use recent advances in neuropsychology to give the concept of brainwashing something it has never had and sorely lacks, a precise scientific definition." So please welcome Dr. Zablocki.
Well, thank you all for coming to listen to this somewhat scary topic of brainwashing. I want to start by, did everybody get a handout? Anybody not? Okay, good. Brainwashing is certainly not an easy concept to pin down. For decades, it's been one of the most controversial of all words in the vocabulary of those who try to understand cults. Many scholars even doubt whether something called brainwashing should be spoken of at all, regarding it as nothing more than an insulting label used to scare people about the activities of socially unpopular groups. On the contrary, I'm going to try to convince you today that brainwashing is not only a valid scientific concept, but an essential one if we are to have any hope of understanding cults and helping people recover from cults. For practical knowledge of brainwashing, three things are needed: to understand precisely what brainwashing is, to understand how it works, and to understand how the victims of brainwashing can be helped and cured. And I do maintain that it is possible to cure people, even who have been thoroughly brainwashed for many years. I want to start by saying briefly what my evidence is for being so sure that brainwashing is a real phenomenon, something that really exists and needs to be taken seriously. I've been studying cults for 54 years. I began in the 1960s and have kept at it all these years. I've interviewed hundreds of ex-members of various different cults, religious, political, psychological, dietary, and anything you might want to think about. I've also had the opportunity to interview a handful of ex-cult leaders who have regretfully admitted that they themselves used brainwashing techniques on their members. And although the number of ex-cult leaders that I interviewed was small, it has more than anything else
Okay.
Good thing that you've been doing it for so long. You can just take it all in your stride, right?
Sorry.
Well,
Streamed.
yes, 50 years of running seminars where everything that can go wrong does go wrong, prepared me
If you
for
don't mind holding
tonight.
on a second, I'll just find out if it's
It
on.
should be okay.
Okay, got it.
Okay, ready to go again? Okay. I've spent varying amount of time over the years in over 100 different cults, sometimes for just a day or two, sometimes for months. And in a few of them, actually experienced personally some of the early stages of brainwashing. I am not going to say that I was ever brainwashed, but I experienced some of the early stages of it and felt them, felt the way they were affecting me enough to get a personal feel for the way this works. Now, I must add, so that I don't seem too cocksure, that brainwashing is still only partially understood. Our understanding of the phenomenon is growing by the year with advances in neuroscience and the clinical study of trauma and addiction. But my comments tonight should not be taken as fully established science, but rather as a mixture of facts, opinions, theories, and conjectures. We know a lot more about brainwashing than we did 10 years ago. In fact, I would be more confident than in that quote that you read of mine now. And we will, I'm confident, know more 10 years from now than we know today. This is a rapidly advancing field. Because it's such a controversial field, let's start with talking about what brainwashing is not. Not everything bad that happens to people in cults is brainwashing. To claim that it is only makes it easier for opponents of the concept to discredit the concept as a whole. A cult is nothing more than a charismatic leader and a bunch of followers. It's got a very simple definition, in my opinion. All cults are potentially dangerous because charismatic power tends to corrupt. And over time, charismatic leaders, even if they're beneficent to begin with, go a little crazy and in a harmful way. But not all cults brainwash their members, and that should be borne in mind. Brainwashing is not some new, mysterious, secret, esoteric form of influence. It uses only common techniques of persuasion well known to any Psych 101 student, but orchestrated in a concentrated and a particularly harmful way. It is not a wholesale technique for obtaining members, but a retail technique for retaining members. And that's a misunderstanding that has pervaded the literature, so I want to emphasize this point, that when the Moonies or some of the other big cults of the 1970s brought together hundreds of people in a stadium or some other large venue and persuaded them to join, to leave their old lives behind and join, that was not brainwashing. That was mass persuasion. Brainwashing is not easy or inexpensive to do. It cannot be applied to hordes of people at a time, although mass persuasion is sometimes confused with brainwashing. When people say TV advertising brainwashes us, they are confusing mass persuasion with brainwashing, and I believe it's important to keep those two concepts distinct from one another. Also, brainwashing has nothing to do with destroying free will and absolving people from the responsibility to one another or in courts of law. Nor is it an all-purpose excuse for having a guilty conscience, for saying something like, "Oh, I didn't mean to do it, I must have been brainwashed." Brainwashing does not disable people, rather it enables them to become effective agents of the cult. It does not turn people into morons or robots, but leaves them intact as highly functioning, deployable agents. For this reason, many people who've been brainwashed never realize that they've been brainwashed. They feel that they're functioning better and more efficiently than they ever have before. And this is a difficulty sometimes in dealing with people trying to get them to separate from cults, is they feel things are hunky-dory even though they are totally at the beck and call of the charismatic leader. Okay, but I hear you say, why do we have to use that word? Why that word, brainwashing? It's been so misused by the media to tarnish unpopular ideologies for so many years. Hasn't it been completely ruined for scientific use? Shouldn't we turn instead to alternatives like the term mind control or thought reform or coercive persuasion? Now, I myself, with my background of training in mathematics, don't really care what term we use. We could call it XYZ for all I care, as long as we all agreed on a definition and we're all knew that we were talking about the same thing. But I tend in my own work to use the term and like the term brainwashing because it's just a literal translation of the term first used by the Chinese communists who pioneered the technique. Shino, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right, is composed of the ideogram, which is literally wash and brain. And I think that the Maoists, in using those terms to describe what they were doing to people, understood the subjective experience of feeling that one has been washed clean by the process. Okay, enough about what brainwashing is not. What about what brainwashing is? It is not a metaphor, but a real process whose progress and effects can be scientifically measured. Perhaps not entirely today, but we're moving in the direction of being able to look on functional MRIs and PET scans and see what is going on in the brain when a person is being brainwashed. Let me give you my definition of brainwashing, and it's a complicated one, so I'm going to read it to you twice. Brainwashing is an observable set of transactions between a totalistically structured group and an isolated member of that group to transform that member into a deployable agent. In other words, one who can be trusted to obey even when removed from the group, even when removed from the scrutiny of the group and on his own or her own. To repeat, brainwashing is an observable set of transactions between a totalistically structured group and an isolated member of that group to transform that member into a deployable agent, one who can be trusted to obey even when removed from the group. It was outlined succinctly and I think very, very well by Robert J. Lifton many years ago, and it consists of a sequence of phases first identified by Robert J. Lifton, 3 phases: identity stripping, in which the old identity is taken away. Often people are given a new name, new clothing, are told that their family and their friends from their old life does not matter, their education does not matter, their profession does not matter, and at the same time, this identification vacuum that's created by identification stripping is filled by a full and complete identification with the group of charismatic followers that comprises the cult. And the third stage, which sometimes is not reached, in fact I would say often is not reached, is called by Lifton symbolic death and rebirth. And it consists of a kind of a catharsis in which one actually feels, not that you've died, but that you have had an experience which is like the death of the old self and a rebirth of a new self, a new and better way of being. Now Lifton I think accurately again, further breaks down these three stages into these three phases into 11 stages. Now, I don't have time tonight to go through those 11 stages, but I brought another handout with me that lists those 11 stages and their effects on both the cognitive function and the emotions of the individual. And anybody who is interested, I'll be happy to give you one later. Brainwashing to be successful, has three environmental prerequisites. One, the charismatic leader, which we've already talked about. Two, the ideologically attractive group, a group of followers of the leader who seem to be doing something to help, to improve the world, to save the world, something which is extremely attractive to the person. And third, and perhaps most important, a 24-hour-a-day totalistic control of all aspects of the physical environment. Brainwashing is not possible while a person has a cell phone that works and can communicate with the outside world. So no cell phones, no other phones, no TV, no radio, no outside stimuli while brainwashing is going on. When successful, brainwashing results, the payoff for the cult and for the charismatic leader is that the person enters a state of what I call hyper-compliance, a willingness to do anything one is told to do by the leader, even to the point of committing suicide or abusing loved ones. I think that many, if not all, terrorist cells are really cults, and this can be seen perhaps more dramatically in those groups nowadays. The most horrendous example of this that I ever encountered was a father who beat his own child to death, egged on by the charismatic leader who was trying to rid the child of devils. That's an extreme example of how hypercompliance can cause one to do things that are extremely ego-dystonic. Ego-dystonic is a term psychologists use to describe things that are totally against anything that you would normally believe or normally consider doing. Briefly now, let me turn to how brainwashing works. I only have time to very briefly touch on these, and I can expand on them all later if you would like. First, it's important to understand that brainwashing in cults, American cults at least, if not those in other countries, is always voluntary in nature. Cults in general do not have bars on the windows and the doors to prevent people from leaving. There are a few actually who do, but for the most part, one can say, "Oh, you could leave anytime you want to. Nobody's holding you here." So, in order to be successful, the individual has to want to be brainwashed. Now, neither the cult nor the individual will call it being brainwashed. They will call it something like being re-educated or reformed or liberated from hang-ups of the past. But it's extremely important that the individual enter this voluntarily. It's difficult enough and causes enough stress and trauma without having to cope with the fact that the person has doubts about whether they want to do it in the first place. The brainwashing process itself involves two cognitive sub-processes that I could spend all evening talking about, and unfortunately I'm not going to be able to do justice to them this evening. but they're called unlearning and new learning or relearning. Unlearning is a concept that is only starting to be fully understood by neuropsychologists and neuroscientists. It's not the same thing as forgetting. When you unlearn, you dissociate yourself with things that you past attitudes, beliefs, values, loyalties that you had in the past. You may remember that you once had them, but they no longer seem like they're a part of you. And that unlearning is accompanied by new learning of the group's or the charismatic leader's ideology and belief system. Now, those are both cognitive processes, but it's extremely important to understand about brainwashing that brainwashing is not only a cognitive process, it's also an emotional process. And changes in cognition, changes in one's emotions go on at the same time. As one is unlearning old beliefs and attitudes and loyalties and substituting new ones, one is also developing an addictive relationship to the group, an emotion-based loyalty to the group based not on what one thinks but what one feels, a sense that the group and the charismatic leader are all important, and that one cannot bear, the person cannot bear to be rejected by the group or even ignored by the group or shunned by the group. One brainwashed person learns to need the constant approval of the collectivity. Now, there's always a possibility of backsliding because, as I said before, unlearning is not the same thing as forgetting. You may get a new name, a spiritual name, for example, in your cult, but you don't forget the name that you were born with, that your parents gave you when you were born. And so there's always a possibility of backsliding. So brainwashing also induces trauma. It induces a traumatic aversion to the old stuff, to the forbidden or to the sinful. And finally, it produces a what I refer to as increased exit costs. What do I mean by exit costs? As I said before, there are no bars on the doors or the windows. People are nominally free to leave anytime they want to. So to be successful, the emotional cost of leaving has to be amplified for the brainwashed person, so that the person that you feel you cannot live without the cult, and that the outside world is evil and will destroy you. Now, all this, I've just been talking about gloom and doom, but let me end on a more optimistic note. Brainwashing does not have to be permanent. In fact, it will not be permanent if it's not reinforced from time to time by the charismatic leader, by the cultic environment. That being said, I do know, I've interviewed over the years some very sad cases of people who joined cults as teenagers and now, as old men and women, are still members of the cult. And they're still dancing to the tune of the charismatic leader and doing anything, no matter how ridiculous, no matter how harmful, that the charismatic leader says. So I don't want to say that brainwashing is never permanent, but it doesn't have to be permanent. The brain has a remarkable ability to self-repair. And once a person is removed from the cult environment, this self-repair will go on, but go on very gradually and may take many, many years. For that reason, many people, the parents, loved ones, friends of an ex-cult member, want to do something to speed it up. And there are three things that are generally turned to. One is turning to, and now for the moment I'm going to assume, although not all cults are religious, I'm going to just be talking about religious cults, turning to a more benign religion, to a religion that still gives you the gratification of belonging to a religious congregation and having a set of beliefs, but doesn't have the all-encompassing demands of a cultic religion. A second thing that is turned to is deprogramming. In the 1970s and 80s, this was very popular, that people were sometimes kidnapped from their groups and put through a process which can be described as being brainwashed away from being brainwashed. Deprogramming, justly, I think, has a bad reputation. It often does more harm than good. At the very best, it's first aid. It's not a cure for having been brainwashed, but it could be a useful way of getting people out of a lot of trouble very quickly. But to my mind, the most effective way of accelerating the process of recovery from brainwashing is psychotherapy. I've seen excellent results by psychotherapists who know what they're doing in dealing with ex-cult members. Now, the key phrase there is know what they're doing, because the great majority of psychotherapists have no idea what a cult is, and even less of a clue as to how to deal with an ex-member of a cult. It's not intuitive, it's not obvious, and if the psychotherapist doesn't know from experience or from training what is being done, they will wind up spinning their wheels and at best wasting the ex-member's time. But if you can find a good psychotherapist who does have experience with ex-cult members and does have experience with the after effects of brainwashing, this can be an excellent way of dealing with it. Even under the best of circumstances, the psychotherapist always needs to guard against the possibility of emotional transference from the guru to the therapist. By this I mean that it's very often found in psychotherapy sessions that the ex-cult member wants to make the therapist into the new guru, perhaps unconsciously, not even aware that they're doing it, but wants to turn to them as the answer to all their questions. And that has to be rigorously guarded against. So, in conclusion, your brain and my brain are vulnerable in totalistic environments to systematic manipulation. I don't know of anybody who is immune to this, who can safely spend lots of time in cults and not be eventually succumb to the lure. I know I can't, and I know a lot about the harmful effects of brainwashing, and I still would not trust myself to be a part of this totalistic environment. The neurological consequences of these manipulations can be observed on using functional MRIs or PET scans, and they fit well with the symptoms described by brainwashing victims. So, last thought, beware of totalist environments, especially those that offer any kind of relief or salvation. Shun them, escape from them. Do not fool yourself into thinking that you can resist them or pick and choose from among what they offer. Thank you.
Thank you.